Denmark, often hailed as a bastion of democracy, social welfare, and progressivism, is facing a critical moment in 2024. While the country is still viewed globally as a symbol of prosperity, with its well-functioning healthcare system, education, and enviable work-life balance, it is also wrestling with complex political, economic, and social challenges. Behind its polished exterior, Denmark grapples with issues ranging from immigration and national identity to economic inequality and the future of its cherished welfare state. These tensions have led to the introduction of some of the most restrictive immigration policies in Danish history, culminating in a highly controversial decision to ban certain categories of immigrants in 2024. Denmark's decision to ban specific groups of immigrants marks a significant shift in its long-standing approach to immigration. Historically, the country was known for its relative openness, particularly in the mid-20th century, when it welcomed refugees fleeing conflicts in the Middle East and Eastern Europe. However, in recent years, rising concerns over social integration, pressure on public services, and questions about cultural cohesion have fueled an increasingly heated debate. These issues came to a head in 2023, when the Danish government enacted a controversial ban on certain immigrants, arguing that the country's resources were overstretched and that further immigration could threaten national stability. The decision did not come out of nowhere. For years, Denmark has seen increasing support for more conservative, nationalist policies. Political parties advocating stricter controls on immigration have gained traction by highlighting the perceived failures of integrating newcomers into Danish society. There is a growing fear that Denmark's national identity, shaped by centuries of homogeneity and social welfare, is under threat. Critics argue that immigrants, particularly from non-Western countries, have struggled to assimilate, creating enclaves of poverty and social isolation, especially in urban areas like Copenhagen. The strain on Denmark's welfare state is one of the key arguments made by proponents of tighter immigration controls. Denmark's social safety net, which provides universal healthcare, free education, and robust unemployment benefits, has been the envy of the world for decades. However, this system is not immune to pressure. With an aging population and increasing healthcare costs, the Danish government faces tough choices about how to maintain its welfare programs without overburdening taxpayers. The addition of new immigrants, particularly those needing social support, is seen by some as an unsustainable burden on public finances. This growing financial strain has led to a rising sense of economic insecurity among many Danes, particularly those in working-class and rural areas. While the country overall remains prosperous, there is an increasing gap between the wealthy and the poor. Urban centers, especially Copenhagen, have experienced a housing crisis as property prices have surged, making it difficult for low- and middle-income families to afford housing. This, in turn, has stoked resentment towards immigrants, who are often blamed for exacerbating housing shortages and placing additional pressure on public services. Denmark's internal struggles are also reflected in its stance within the European Union. On May 16, 2024, a letter signed by 15 EU member states, including Denmark, called for a radical shift in how Europe manages migration and asylum. The letter advocates for the outsourcing of migration control to countries outside of the EU. Led by Denmark, these nations argue that the rising number of irregular migrants is unsustainable and that Europe must look for solutions outside its borders. The proposal suggests that countries along migration routes, such as Turkey, Tunisia, and Egypt, should play a larger role in handling asylum claims, with financial support from the EU. These deals would resemble existing arrangements like the 2016 EU-Turkey deal, which aimed to curb the flow of migrants into Europe. Denmark's leading role in this initiative highlights its evolving stance on immigration. By pushing for externalization, Denmark and other EU nations aim to reduce the influx of migrants and alleviate pressure on their domestic systems. However, this approach raises ethical questions. Critics argue that outsourcing migration policies shifts the burden onto poorer countries, many of which are already struggling with large refugee populations. There are also concerns about the human rights conditions in these countries, with many activists warning that vulnerable migrants may face exploitation or abuse. Denmark's support for outsourcing migration policies has sparked intense debate within the country. On the one hand, proponents argue that it's a pragmatic solution to a growing problem. They contend that Denmark cannot continue to accept large numbers of migrants without compromising its social stability, and that partnering with countries along migration routes is a responsible way to manage the issue. Supporters also point out that Denmark and the EU are providing financial aid to these countries, which can help improve their infrastructure and refugee services. On the other hand, critics argue that this strategy is morally questionable. They claim that outsourcing Denmark's migration issues to other nations, many of which are far less equipped to handle large numbers of refugees, is both unfair and dangerous. These critics also highlight the hypocrisy of wealthier countries like Denmark, which have benefited from globalization and free movement, now turning their backs on those in need. Within Denmark, the immigration debate has deepened political and social divides. The country's traditionally liberal social values are now being challenged by more conservative elements that emphasize cultural preservation and national security. Many Danes, particularly in rural areas, feel alienated by the rapid pace of social and demographic change and fear that the influx of immigrants will erode the country's cultural identity. Meanwhile, urban areas like Copenhagen, which are more diverse and globally connected, tend to support more liberal immigration policies. This divide is not only geographical but generational, with younger Danes generally being more open to immigration than their older counterparts. Despite these challenges, Denmark remains a leader in global humanitarian efforts. It continues to contribute significant funds to international aid organizations and supports global efforts to combat climate change, which is itself a major driver of migration. However, the country's internal struggles over immigration reflect a broader trend across Europe, where the rise of nationalism and populism has reshaped political landscapes and tested the limits of multiculturalism. Denmark's dark side, marked by its challenges with immigration, social cohesion, and economic inequality, is a reflection of the complex realities facing modern nations. While the country continues to uphold many of its progressive values, it is clear that the pressures of globalization and migration are testing the limits of its social fabric. The 2024 decision to ban certain immigrants, along with its leadership in outsourcing EU migration policies, signals a shift in Denmark's approach to these issues. Whether these policies will help or harm the country remains to be seen, but one thing is clear. Denmark, like many other nations, is struggling to find a balance between maintaining its identity and adapting to the realities of an interconnected world. As Denmark navigates these uncertain waters, the country will need to carefully consider both the ethical and practical implications of its policies. The choices made today will shape the future of its society, economy, and its role within Europe for years to come.